I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. As is the plan every week, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Great to have you on the show, Elizabeth. We have today an update on a case we discussed last week, and then also an update on a case from several years ago. So let's start off with Gabriel Moreno. This case has gone the way of the previous trial, where they attempted once again to have a new trial, and it turned out the same way.
Yes, Chance. It's good to be back. Wow, this Gabriel Moreno trial was something else. The jury, as we discussed, was trying to decide whether or not he was guilty of murder in the death of Jose Luis Menchaca. Well, what we learned this week was that they're really, this is going to have to go to another jury, because the jury did what we call deadlock. They basically could not decide, and you have to have a unanimous verdict for a murder trial to get someone, to get a guilty verdict, to get a conviction on someone for murder. It must be unanimous. So a couple of thoughts about that was that the defense pointed out that all of the witnesses had something to lose in the deal, I guess you could say. There were a lot of people who saw what happened to Jose Menchaca, and three of them testified. And, he also took into consideration that key testimony came from Menchaca's girlfriend, who admitted on the witness stand that she was a heroin addict. So when you kind of looking at this as the amateur that I am, I just write what I see. You see that the jury probably had difficulty making Moreno completely responsible for the murder itself. The medical examiner testified that there weren't any fingerprints on anything that they picked up that related to Moreno. And there wasn't any DNA that really had him, doing the things that the witnesses testified to. So we're going to be visiting this some other time.
Now, you say another time, so this is something, have they already announced that they're going to retry this? Because that's something that happened recently with the trial of Bill Cosby, where the trial did not conclude with a verdict one way or the other, but the DA at the time said, oh no, we are going to retry this, and that's kind of happening right now as we speak. So have they announced that this will be retried, or are you just assuming at this point?
Well, let's put it this way. When Judge Ron Rangel announced to the gallery at 4:00 Friday that this was going to be a mistrial, he did say the words, because there was no verdict in this case, another jury is going to have to hear all of the evidence and make many of the decisions that faced you guys. So that tells me that, at the very least, the judge, sees that it's going to be coming back. I mean, I think that there has to be a lot of time passed and looking at a lot of the evidence, before they decide that they're not going to do something like that. In fact, I don't have a law degree, so I'm not sure about that. But, all indications are that he's going to be coming back to trial, as is his cousin, Daniel Moreno Lopez, whose own trial this time last year ended in a mistrial, although his, it didn't last as long as Moreno's did. So we will definitely be seeing them, and as well as the other co-defendant, Candy Dominguez, who was Jose Menchaca's cousin. We will see her probably come to trial soon as well.
Yeah, so more to be said there. Perhaps we'll pick this up in the coming months. So that's the Gabriel Moreno mistrial. As you mentioned, a previous mistrial involving a cousin. So yeah, time will tell with that one. You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. Elizabeth, we now have an update on a case that we've never discussed on this podcast. We've only been doing this, for a matter of weeks. But this is a case from the past where several people have been sentenced. And then this last Friday, I believe, there was what would appear to be the final sentencing in the case of Josiah Williams, a very sad but also very tragic in a way that is quite shocking case of a 5-year-old boy who is no longer alive.
Right. Yes. This is, as you said, definitely. I don't even know if you can say it's the end of a sad saga, but because this child is no longer with us. But the last adult in this case of Josiah Williams, who was 5 years old, who died from malnourishment and injuries received from beatings on December 27th, 2012, when the medical examiner said that little Josiah's battered and malnourished body weighed 38 pounds at the time that he died. This was a really, really sad case in the San Antonio and Bexar County community in 2012 when this happened. When first responders found him, he was unresponsive at the home that he shared with his father, Charleston Williams, who was sentenced to 40 years on Friday for injury to a child, serious bodily injury by omission. He is the last person to be convicted and sentenced in this tragedy. His wife, Crystal Williams, was sentenced in June of 2016, and her mother, that would have been Josiah's step-grandmother, was sentenced in 2017 for her part in the child's death. All of them were found guilty of injury to a child, serious bodily injury by omission. Essentially, Chance, what happened is this child was, for some reason, kept away from his siblings and from other children because he wasn't even going to school. And he was not fed and not provided medical attention for his injuries or his condition from not having the proper nutrition. It was a very, very sad case. Crystal Williams was the first to go to trial. And at her trial in June 2016, she testified through sobs that she should have sought medical care for her stepson. Let me tell you a little bit about this family. Josiah's father is Charleston Williams, and his mother's name is Carlotta. They, were no longer married, and Carlotta was involved in a drug case, and she went to I believe state jail for a couple of years, and so during this time, Josiah was being raised by his grandmother, Patty Ojeda Quintero, and at some point, Charleston decided that he wanted to get custody of his son because he had remarried and he had a child with Crystal, and they were also raising one of her children from a previous relationship. So they took Josiah from his grandmother, and he moved in with Charleston and Crystal and a half sister and a stepbrother. So at some point, something happened that Josiah was being kept away when first responders found him. It appeared that he had been living in a closet and sleeping on a lawn chair that crime scene investigators who testified at both trials said, was soaked with urine, and inside of the closet he was, surrounded by, feces, and basically, it just was not something that he, should have been, that anybody really should have been, going through. But at her trial, Crystal Williams, she cried uncontrollably in the punishment phase of her trial when her defense attorney, Ray Martinez, showed pictures of all of her children. And she told jurors that Josiah was a finicky eater, but when she had sought medical help and advice, that she had been denied. And that's a real key part of this case, Chance, because it is basically talking about, your responsibility. She was a stepmother, but especially the way the charge is written, you have care, custody, and control, and you're supposed to be able to provide, like in this case, the child was alleged to have been not, gotten to a doctor at all for anything, and that he was not being fed. So they were not, providing the things that, a normal person who had legal responsibility for a child and had assumed care, custody, control, should have done, even though she was not a blood relative. So witnesses for the state had testified that, in the grandmother's trial, that Josiah was not in school, and that Gloria Pro was a primary caretaker for Josiah, his half-sister, and his stepbrother. And even though she, maintained that she did not live with them, a relative testified that even though she did not, technically live with them, she stayed there. So, I guess anybody who's ever had relatives who've watched, their kids, or if you've ever been watched by a relative, that's a broad definition when you say, yeah, well, they stay there. It's kind of like an open-ended thing. Other witnesses who testified at both of these trials made mention of a barbecue that had occurred at the home where Josiah lived with his family in November 2012. This was around Thanksgiving and before Christmas. That Josiah had been placed in time out and was not allowed to eat with the rest of the guests. And later on, he was allowed to eat leftovers. So there were people who had gone inside this house and had really seen what became apparent at both of these trials, that Josiah wasn't being treated like the other kids in the house. So there was so many sad things in these trials, but one of the things that came out in Gloria Pro's trial was that 4 days before he died, Gloria Pro babysat Josiah while his parents took the other siblings to Fiesta, Texas to meet Santa Claus. And he was punished somehow and told to stay home. 5-year-old kid, you don't get to meet Santa Claus. That's kind of a big deal.
And so with the sentencing here of these three people, the father, Charleston Williams, on Friday sentenced to 40 years in prison. But as you already mentioned, his wife, who is not the biological mother of Josiah, sentenced to life in prison in June of 2016. And then last year, this grandmother, who once again, not a biological grandmother, but Crystal's mother, Gloria Pro, sentenced to 88 years in prison. So the man in this scenario, who's actually related to this child who's no longer with us, he received, if you will, the lowest sentence of the three.
Yes, and this is very interesting. Now, he basically took a plea bargain which in this case was probably, if you look at the other two sentences, it's probably a pretty good idea that he did take a plea, because who knows what, a jury would have given him. What the thing that's been maintained about Charleston Williams throughout was that he worked all the time. His mother testified at his sentencing that there was a pre-sentencing investigation hearing in Judge Ron Rangel's court, which is the 379th State District Court. In fact, Judge Rangel presided over all three of these cases. At Friday's hearing, Charleston's mother said, she said her son is a good man. She mentioned that he, part of the reason why a lot of this happened was because he worked all the time. He worked 6 days a week, sometimes more, worked as much overtime as he could, because he was, the only one in the house who worked. So there were 6 people living in the house, and he, needed to provide for all of them. So, she, called him a protector of women and children, which prompted a response from Stephanie Boyd, a Bexar County Assistant District Attorney. She has prosecuted all 3 of these cases, and the only question that she had for Charleston Williams' mother after that was, did he protect his son? Which she replied no. But she was very emotional on the stand with the judge, and she basically pointed to everything that happened at Crystal. She said she was the one who was in charge in the relationship, and that it got to the point that once he was with her, that her son could no longer speak to his mother except if it was done on a speakerphone. And I guess the implication there is that Crystal had to hear whatever he was saying, even if it was to his mother. So, she painted this picture that, he really wasn't in control as to what, was going on in the home. He was just working and, going to work, coming home and going to sleep type thing. So, but when Charleston Williams spoke to the court on his own behalf, it was a very, very emotional moment. He wept or sobbed through most of his statement and apologized to Josiah's mother, Carlotta, and her family, and asked them for forgiveness. He said that he was not the father that he needed to be for his son. And he was so overcome by emotion, he had to be held, from collapsing by his attorney, Charles Bunk. Bunk had asked the judge for 30 years, telling the court that his client knows that he was partially responsible for what happened. And because of that, he asked the judge for leniency, because he said that, through this plea, that Charleston was the only one of the 3 who took responsibility for his part for what happened to his son. But Judge Rangel sentenced him to the maximum allowed by the plea bargain, which is 40 years in prison. Yeah, but as I said earlier, had he gone to trial, he likely would have faced the maximum life in prison, and would have seen the sentences, that his wife and his mother-in-law got. So, in a very emotional victim impact statement, some of Josiah's relatives on his mother's side, spoke to Charleston, and probably the one that really the statements that stood out to me were that a aunt and sister of Carlotta's told Charleston in the court that she has to forgive him because that's what religion says that we should do. And but she said that she also wanted for him to look at his life. Now, Josiah's maternal grandmother, Patty Quintero, definitely feels that justice was not served for her grandson. I think she definitely wanted to see a higher sentence. In fact, in her emotional victim impact statement, she told him she felt like he needed to be on death row. And she called his 40 years cushy, and said that he hoped that he spent every day, thinking about that. So, a person who receives a life sentence after being convicted of injury to a child is eligible for parole after serving about 30 years. So, he could be getting out a little sooner than that, but 40 years is a long time. And, Chance, the frightening thing is, I was trying to look at some of these injury to a child cases that involve, withholding food, withholding medical care. You do a Google search and you find so many cases, not just in Texas. It's really kind of frightening to even put a number on it, But, I wanted to share one thing that was just, these cases involving kids are so sad. And, but one of the things that really stuck out to me in watching these all three of these cases, go, to their ends is something that Stephanie Boyd has said in her closing arguments in some of the cases, and also mentioned during the pre-sentencing investigation, is that, she said that this 5-year-old boy, who lived such a hard life, likely died thinking that, nobody loved him. And, gosh, you think about that and that just pierces you right in the heart.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what that child had gone through, but the real unfortunate thing here is that, as you just mentioned, Elizabeth, not an isolated case in Texas, and certainly not an isolated case in other states. So this one, some closure, but as you mentioned, the run of the relatives of this deceased 5-year-old boy who died back in 2012 in December, I believe you said, thought that some of the sentences were a little too cushy. But once again, perhaps compared to some other cases that you found during your searching, I think quite a lot of years here, despite that. Claimed 40 years for the father. The stepmother sentenced to life in prison in June of 2016. And her mother, Gloria Pro, sentenced last year to 88 years in prison. Of course, not always serving every year that you're sentenced to in the prison system. So, we'll see what happens with this down the road. But yeah, well, let's end there on that really sad note there, Elizabeth, with such a sad case. But once again, some closure here is the third person has been sentenced for the 2012 injury to a child death of Josiah Williams, a 5-year-old boy. Elizabeth, good to talk to you today about these two cases, both of them from the past, crimes that took place many years ago. We haven't had a verdict in the murder trial case. This time around, a mistrial in Gabriel Moreno, previously a mistrial in his cousin's case, but we'll probably see both of those cases come back to trial here in the future, and we'll talk about that here on the docket. So good discussion today, Elizabeth, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks very much.
And thanks again to San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. And I do just want to note, some of the cases we discuss here are very difficult to talk about, just even from my perspective as someone just discussing them, let alone someone who has to go to the court cases and really study them and really become a part of them the way that Elizabeth does. So I appreciate the fact that she's able to discuss these very hard-hitting issues with me every week. Once again, this episode brought to you today by our sponsor of The Docket, the law offices of Pat Maloney. For expressnews.com, I'm Chance Dorland.